Code software. Well, been there, did that. Welcome to the To Code Software Podcast, episode 10. We made it all the way to number 10.
Woo!
My name is Tim Purdom.
And I'm Tim J.
And today we're going to do another deep dive on a topic. Last time, Tim asked me about Blazor, and I got to talk about my experience with Blazor. So we're going to flip the table today, and I'm going to ask him about ORMs, and in particular one that he's got a lot of experience with, which is, why don't you tell us what it's called?
It's NPoco, and that's just the letter N. It is a branch off of something called NPoco, which is a .NET write of a Java library. And I don't remember the original Java library. It might have been JPoco. So NPoco hasn't been updated in some number of years, but it was a very excellent project. And this guy named Showtime, Schotime, which is an amazing name, did a fork off of it called NPoco, and that's the one I'm talking about.
Yeah. So maybe my first question is, what is an ORM?
An ORM is an object relationship mapper. And what it really is it's a way to try to solve a problem called impedance mismatch, which is to say that when we're storing data in a relational database, various different SQL dialects, the data has to be stored in a very row and column sort of way. And there's only certain data types that are allowed. And while we can define their relationships with foreign keys and one-to-many and one-to-one relationships, the way that we store that data in our actual code is often quite a bit different than that way it is stored in the database. That's the impedance mismatch. And an ORM is designed to make the translation to and from a database just much easier to deal with.
So there's a disconnect here between the way it's stored in the database and the way we want to use it in the code. And so the ORM is trying to bridge that gap between the two, right?
Yes. Objects have relationships in programs, and those are often expressed as a one-to-one or one-to-many, and it's very similar to how it sounds. One person has one current address, but one person may have many, many former addresses. And so in a database, you might store the person's information in one table and a list of addresses in another table, and you need to use a join in order to find out all of the addresses the person has lived in. And an ORM is able to take all of that functionality and make it very easy for you to write that query and then return that data as a series of hydrated objects where you've got, say, one person, and inside of it they have a list of addresses. And these can be fully typed objects, very often referred to as POCOs, which stands for plain old C object. It's that old from way back in C, but it generally just refers to objects that have no behavior. It's just a bunch of public properties that are gettable and settable with no constructor. It's just designed to hold data and marshal it around. They can also be called DTOs for data transfer objects. The exact same idea.
Right. Well, you mentioned a couple things there about mapping directly to the POCO, and I know in Java they say POJO, I think, or something like that. So there's a lot of different things. A couple things I wanted to say about that. One was obviously NPoco. That's where it gets its name, right?
Yep. It's the .NET version of a POCO manager, whereas JPoco was the Java version of that.
So N is for net, for .NET?
Yep.
Okay. The other thing I was going to say is just comparing this. So the old school way of doing it would literally be in your C# or whatever programming language you're in. You're constructing a string that then you're going to pass to the SQL database, and that's going to run that as a SQL command. And then you have to parse back the results from it, right?
Yep.
And this is kind of abstracting a lot of that work away from the developer so that, number one, they don't have to be super strong in SQL when they're writing from their other language like C sharp.
I find one of the best uses of it isn't necessarily to get away from the SQL, it's to fix very common errors. In the old ADO.NET way of doing things, which really under the hood is what NPoco is doing, is just using ADO.NET. You have to open up your connection, you have to create a command, you have to set the command text, you can fire it off and get a DB data reader, and then you have to iterate through all of the rows in the reader and iterate through all of the fields in that row, and then do type conversion in order to set all of the properties of your object. And if you're having to do this time and time again, there's a lot of code there that is very easy to make a mistake on. Since it's all this setup code, you're going to want to copy and paste it, and then one little mistake, you think something is an int and it's a decimal, you think a string of any size can fit in there, but it can only hold 32 characters. You end up with a lot of chances to make mistakes, and these mistakes are sometimes very difficult to find. But in ORM, you can define things in a way that is completely consistent across everything. So instead of having to create a connection, open it, create a command, and set all of this, you can just say, here is the SQL command I wish to execute. Here is the type of data I would like you to return, and it will do all of that for you.
Now, I know there's a lot of different ORMs out there, and there's even like this idea of micro ORM versus full scale ORM. Do you have a clear definition of that difference, or do you know what that refers to?
Yes. Well, as much as I can say. I've used in quotes here 4 different ORMs in my own personal projects and such. And I would say no ORM is where you're just in raw ADO. One step above that is a wonderful utility called Dapper, which was made by the team at Stack Overflow, which is really just extension methods off of IDB command and IDB connection, the standard ADO.NET way of doing things, that give you just a little bit more functionality. Generally, it's just a little bit of mapping for certain types of very quick select statements. A micro ORM in that case is that the original version of Dapper, and I'm not sure if this is still the case, was only a few hundred lines of code that you could just copy paste into your project. You wouldn't even have to reference like a NuGet package or anything because it was just very, very slim.
Right.
And there are a few extensions onto it to allow you to do inserts and updates and deletes, but the idea behind a micro ORM is just one step over ADO.NET. And the main reason for that is speed. Dapper is only a tiny fraction slower than doing everything yourself.
Right.
Whereas on the other side of the spectrum, you have something like Entity Framework, which is Microsoft's offering, that can do almost anything you can conceivably imagine with a database. But because it's capable of doing that, it can get tricky where you're not entirely sure what SQL statements it's executing under the hood, or you run into select +1 errors, or you run into lazy loading, and there's a lot more gotchas. And it oftentimes can be much slower, and the process of trying to make it faster can sometimes take enough time that you might have been better off with something more toward the middle.
Right. Before I came to our current company, I used Entity Framework Core, and while I don't know enough about it to really argue with you about the finer points of it, I do know that the relationship between EF6, I think was the last one written for .NET Framework, between that and EF Core is very similar to the relationship between .NET Framework and .NET Core, in the sense that they really ripped it apart, started over, tried to make it more performant, tried to make it safer, and all of those things. So I would just say, if you haven't looked at it in a long time, that it's, there's a lot of new stuff there in EF Core, and I think they've worked really hard to improve that product. And I enjoy using it myself.
Yeah, when I used it, it was Entity Framework 4.
Okay,
and at
so
that time, it was,
Yeah.
and it was very slow, and that was my main reason for not using it. I liked a lot of the features, but it was just far too slow for my use case.
Sure.
And at that time, then I tried another one called nhibernate, which N, again, standing for .NET, and I believe it was based upon jhibernate, which was the Java equivalent.
Mm-hmm.
That one was a bit closer to Dapper than, say, Entity Framework was, but in the end, after I was using it for a while, I ran into the same issues with just speed. It took far too long for certain types of queries to execute, and that's when I ended up with NPoco. And NPoco is somewhere in the middle. It is still very fast, and it can do some very close to bare metal queries, but it does offer a few features above Dapper to just make life a little bit easier.
Like what? What do we get with NPoco?
Well, there's this thing called iQueryable. It's very commonly used in Entity Framework, which is a link-like syntax to let you select from a database as if it was just a list of objects. And then you write iQueryable just like any link statement, select, where, order by, and then internally it would read through the expression trees and figure out what the actual SQL statement needs to be, and it would execute that. A lot of people like iQueryable. A lot of people don't think it's a very good idea. The main issue with it is that it can trick people when they don't realize some of what iQueryable is doing is executing on the database, and some of what it's doing is executing locally. And there's that kind of fuzzy line there where if you're not careful, you might do a lot of extra work on the database where you're selecting like 10,000 rows, pulling them locally, and then using one of them.
Right. Well, I was just going to compare that to my experience using those queryables in Entity Framework Core. And I know that the gotcha there a lot of times was the lazy loading. I think you already mentioned it once, but it would delay execution. Well, I guess that's not exactly the same as lazy loading, is it? I know what lazy loading is. That's different.
Yeah. Deferred execution is still a big problem, though.
Right. It was the deferred execution because it was good in the sense that it would try to get all of your statements, whether you had them in one continuous link, dot, select, where, order by, whatever, or whether you had it in multiple lines in different statements until you called toList or toArray or something that forced it to get a concrete collection, it would not actually execute the database command, which is good in the sense of, not giving multiple calls, like you said, to the database. But the downside was you had to be very aware of that. And I know there was a way that you would end up with nothing where you thought you would have some results in there.
Yeah. Lazy loading was similar. It was a feature that was turned on by default where until it knew which properties of an object you were ever accessing, it wouldn't select those properties. So, if you've got some object that is 100 different columns in a table, but you only end up needing 3 or 4 of them, it would try to figure out you only needed those 3 or 4 and then only select those. The issue would be is that a lot of times people would just return these objects without realizing that only a few of the properties had been set because they were expecting to be lazily loaded, and that was another potential issue.
And along with that, I know lazy loading in EF Core also extends to relational connections. So if you have, say, a person record and, like you mentioned before, addresses, well, if the addresses are a list on the person, like it's a one-to-many relationship, it won't load that list of addresses at all unless you specifically tell it to, or I'm sure there's a way to, force Entity Framework to go the other direction. But usually you have to say .include and then do a Lambda statement with person.addresses so that it knows to actually pull all that data.
So NPoco has its own query syntax. It's not a full iQueryable, but it has some link methods where you've got where and order by. And the idea behind it is because it's such a small subset, it kind of guarantees that all of those features work exactly as you would expect, and there's no gotchas that you're going to expect in there. And that's kind of the idea behind NPoco is it's a very limited scope of the features it gives you. And some of those features are very powerful, but in the end, it doesn't as easily let you shoot yourself in the foot, as it were.
So does NPoco use Dapper under the hood, or does it just use ADO and then build off of that?
It uses ADO under the hood.
Okay.
You're thinking of SQL Kata that used
right.
Dapper under the hood.
Yep.
Which I don't know much about. There's many, many, many ORMs. I mean, I'm sure there's at least a dozen of them that are in active development right now, and another dozen that have been updated within the last 2 years.
Sure.
Everything NPoco is, it is open source. You can go onto GitHub, and I will make sure that there's a link to it in the podcast stuff. And here, I'll send it to you right now so I don't forget. You can look at the code, but it's really just doing a lot of ADO underneath the hood, which is also the power of NPoco since it is completely open source and it's relatively easy to understand. Part of it is that it's very, very flexible. You can override almost every single bit of functionality that it's capable of doing, even to the point of being able to map custom types. Postgres, which is my SQL database of choice that I really like, supports not just JSON columns, which is nice because you can use it as a NoSQL database if you want, but it also supports array columns. And normally to try to do that with an ORM, there might be some odd things you have to do, but with NPoco, you can configure it so that, hey, the type of my property is this thing, like a particular type of string, but I want this mapped to a JSON column. And then it will automatically be able to do like JSON verification and push that data back and forth. Or you can say, this property, which is a list, I want this turned into an array inside of the database rather than a many table. And you can override anything you want to in NPoco, so its flexibility was one of the big things that attracted me to it, because the types of data that I was storing sometimes was very different than what you would normally put into a SQL database.
So what does the actual mapping look like when you're consuming NPoco, when you're using it in your code base?
There are several different ways to do mapping with NPoco. The one that uses attributes, which is very similar to a lot of other ORMs, you put attributes on your properties that tell it this is the name of the column inside of the database. You'd put an attribute on the class itself and say this is the name of the table. You could say this particular property is a primary key that is auto-incremented by the database. You could say, I want you to select data into this property but never save data back out, or vice versa, which can get into some more like business rules if you do want to put them on your POCOs. But the way I prefer to use it is a fluent syntax, which is just using expressions where you can leverage the power of lambdas and just fluently map this property maps to this column, this POCO maps to this table. And NPoco gives you a bunch of tools to be able to do that very fluently, which includes like a default configuration. Like if your database was designed very specifically that your primary key is always named ID, it's always lowercase, you can set it up so it just assumes that about every one of the POCOs that you're dealing with. The primary key is going to be named ID. The property is also ID. Maybe it's always an integer. Maybe it's always auto increment. And you can have it just assume, hey, in order to turn a property into a column name, you just lowercase it, or maybe you put underscores between words that would normally be camel case in C#. And it lets you do that fluent configuration. So if you're starting with NPoco and you're designing your database at the same time, you can make those choices for how you design your tables and then make it very easy to use and just assume all your naming schemes. But since you can override every aspect of it, which includes the maps, if you're trying to use NPoco with an existing system, you can still get in there and customize every single property if you wish to.
Yeah, I think the two ways that you described there of mapping those do trigger a lot of memories for me from EF Core because I think it's very similar, where you can do it by attributes on your POCOs or by a fluent mapper. I know EF Core has a class that kind of manages all of this called the database context or DB context.
Hmm.
And maybe that's similar to the config that you're talking about in NPoco. Like that's where you would find your mapping if it was fluent mapping or also relationship mapping, like the
Hmm.
one to many relationships between tables and things.
Hmm. It's a very useful system, and it is one of those things that different ORMs do quite differently. And it was some I mentioned and Hibernate earlier.
Right.
And Hibernate had a very strange requirement where every one of your properties had to be virtual on all of your
Yeah.
POCOs, because what it was doing under the scene was basically making another class that inherited your base POCO in order to speed up some of what it was doing.
Okay.
And I don't like having to do that. I'm not a fan of attributes myself because then you're kind of leaking NPoco specific or ORM specific implementation details
Sure.
on all of your POCOs. Whereas NPoco only requires that it have a public parameterless constructor, which
Okay.
is just basically so that it can be newed up with activator create instance and not, fail in that instance.
Right. Let's just take a little break here and talk about some news or some recollections from previous episodes. Last time we talked about Blazor, and I wanted to point out, and I put this in the show notes for last week's episode, but I missed it. Last month, I believe, the WebAssembly version of Blazor was put in full release. And so,
Oh, wow.
yeah. So I was thinking they were waiting for .NET 5, but they decided to do it here. So that is now no longer in preview. That is fully supported.
Well, that's very cool to hear. It's nice that it came out a lot earlier with .NET 5 still being quite a bit of
Right.
ways.
Yeah. I think originally they wanted to do it all with .NET Core 3, but they just knew it wasn't going to happen in time. So back to NPoco. You mentioned that Postgres also supports NoSQL.
Hmm.
Can you write a NoSQL query with NPoco?
Yes.
Okay.
Postgres' way of doing NoSQL is kind of, I mean, I'm using the word NoSQL in that sense. It's not quite the same, but you can just do a key column and then do a JSON or a JSON B column type, which just holds JSON. And
Okay.
within Postgres, you can do JSON relational queries where you can query inside of a JSON field and search for things by key, nested structures, basically any way you would normally go through a large JSON file. All of that syntax is supported inside of Postgres. And since NPoco is really just a pass through, you can hand write that query with all of that syntax there. And as long as
Mm-hmm.
NPoco has been configured to map correctly, the data that's returned from that query will just get mapped onto whatever your POCO is. There's nothing in there that prevents you from handwriting all of your SQL.
But I know, like, when I'm doing EF Core, I need a different NuGet package if I do it against SQL Server, or if I do it against SQLite, or if I do it against Postgres or MySQL. Like, there's different flavors of the NuGet package.
And those
Is
are entity framework specific.
right. I'm asking
Ah,
if NPoco has something like that, or is it just literally just like a line in the code that you say, "Here's my database type."
NPoco natively supports quite a few different database types: SQL Server, Postgres, MySQL, the very common ones that are out
Mm-hmm.
there. All you have to do is have that particular connector. The one for Postgres is called NPG SQL, which is the .NET Postgres connector, where
Okay.
SQL Server has its own type of connector. So that would be what you would use for ADO.NET. As long as that's installed, NPoco will likely support it. Although you can always just tell it, I'm not going to tell you a database type, and it will assume the base SQL standard, which may mean that certain features don't work. It is an
Right.
example of like limit versus top in different
Mm-hmm.
database types may not work correctly, but you can
Mm-hmm.
always just tell it follow the base SQL standard. And you don't have to install any extra packages to have it do that.
But I guess the difference is you are still required to give it that base connection type that you were saying. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know if connection is the right word, but there was a Postgres object that you
Mm-hmm.
could give it, or an ADO, SQL Server object.
I believe it's called a SQL DB factory, and it's a .NET
Right.
type, and that's kind of the base one that all of the SQL providers extend. And so in NPoco, you give it an instance of a particular factory, and that factory is something that is part of the .NET ADO SQL standard. So
Right.
then PGSQL has its own version, SQL Server has its one. By giving that to NPoco, it's capable of using that factory and saying, give me, say, an IDB connection implementation. And so
Mm-hmm.
it will just use that because it's just IDB connection. It doesn't have to know what it belongs to, but then it can use the other SQL provider to do all of its work rather than having multiple different versions of NPoco depending on what database you're connecting to.
Okay. That explains what I was thinking of from EF Core is simply that all of that building the actual, like the SQL DB factory, is wrapped, I think, in those other NuGet packages I was mentioning. So,
Mm-hmm.
like if I get EF Core dot SQL Server, then it does that work for me, and I don't see any of that.
Mm-hmm.
So I just tell it, like in the ASP.NET Core service provider, the dependency injector, you just say dot add database or something like really stupid like that. And then you say, oh, it's a SQL Server database, by the way. And did you install the right NuGet packages? Yes. Okay. Well, then it's just going to work. But
Mm-hmm.
so NPoco is definitely more micro ORM in that sense that we're
Yes.
still going to create that root ADO object and then give it to NPoco.
And part of that is that it does not support everything. Even its queryable provider has limitations built into there. And if you're familiar with SQL, if you're comfortable writing your SQL statements, NPoco is more useful. The less SQL you know, the less comfortable you are with joining and being careful with all of that, the more something like Entity Framework makes sense because it can hide a lot of that. Whereas NPoco is still anything beyond the simplest of, CRUD operations, you're probably going to be writing the SQL yourself just because it's trying not to do everything for you, just the 90% use cases.
Right. Now, the other part of an ORM or of dealing with SQL databases that we talked about at work was a query builder, which is a little different than a queryable object.
Hmm.
It's more just constructing that SQL string, but doing it in a type safe way using the C sharp and a fluent syntax, right?
Yes. NPoco has one of those.
Okay.
It's SQL.builder. It's built in. It's very simple. Really, all it is a wrapper around a string builder and a list
Mm-hmm.
of objects, which are the parameters. And
Right.
doing that sort of, you're having to hand build some query based upon different parameters passed to a method. With a string builder, then you kind of have to figure out what's the parameter prefix for my database, what numbered parameter am I at. I need to then store that value in that list that I can then create parameters from. And NPoco SQL Builder is just a quick way of writing it in a way that looks like a string builder, but then you
Mm-hmm.
just pass the objects as arguments, just like you would to say string.format. And then internally, it remembers, oh, I need to store this as, say, parameter one and parameter two. And then it can query the database provider and say, all right, I need to add a parameter. How do you want me to declare it? Is it an at symbol or is it, a pound symbol or whatever particular SQL provider needs? It can then kind of fix all of that after the fact, and then you can, instead of having to execute a query where you pass it a string and then a list of objects, you can just pass it the built SQL and it already contains all of that information in there.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I know because our code base is historically DirectAdio.net access or a light wrapper around that. We have a lot of familiarity with writing the SQL statements ourselves, and that was one thing we were looking at was, do we want to just add a query builder that makes that a little more type safe, gets us away from, just string concatenation and interpolation. And that we looked at SQL Kata for that, which also has a query builder. And now then more recently we've been looking at NPoco. Do you know like why we decided to go with NPoco instead of SQL Kata?
NPoco has async support throughout the entire code base, and it's native
Okay.
async support. It's not switching async to sync at some point down the line, unless I believe certain SQL providers don't support async, and in that case it has to do so. But
Sure.
anything modern, Postgres, MySQL, SQL Server, it has async support for every one of its methods, every one of the operations that it can do. And then SQL Kata did not have those features available at the time.
Okay.
That was one of the main reasons.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. I mean, if we want to support that and we don't want it to secretly switch it back under the covers.
To just talk about other really nice things about NPoco, it
Yeah.
has a really wonderful system in there, a series of things they call interceptors, which is a way of automatically knowing information about what it's doing. So you can intercept every single thing where every time a connection is opened, you can do something with that information. Every time a connection is closed, every time a transaction is started, every time one is completed, every time one is aborted. It gives you the ability to add logging to your system. Hey, every time I abort a transaction, I really need to know about this. You can just write your own system to log all of that and then hand an interceptor to NPoco, and then it'll just automatically notify you every time that happens. It formats all of the queries for you. There's a nice, really quick little formatter in there, so you can ask it, okay, the command you're about to execute, show me a very readable explanation of what it is, where it will show you, here's the actual SQL statement, and here
Right.
for each parameter, not just what the parameter value is, but the type of that parameter value. And it gives you the ability to debug those sorts of things. So at any point, if you are just using their query interface and you want to see the exact raw SQL, it's very easy to do so. And I spent only maybe 15 minutes, and it was very easy for me to add a system where I could look and see how long any given query took to execute. And then you could hook that up to your logging system and say, any query that takes more than 5 seconds to execute, I need to know about it. And then you can log when it happened, what database it was being sent to, the entire SQL query, virtually anything you need to know about it. And there's some profiling support in there as well. And I've found that it's very easy to get all of that information out of NPoco at any point that you need it.
Yeah, that would be really nice, especially with logging.
Mm-hmm.
Be able to look back later, not necessarily have to debug and step through, because it's the atomic scientist problem where the observer affects the thing that they're observing.
Mm-hmm.
Quantum physics, that's what I'm
There
thinking
you
of.
go.
Like the state is set once you look at it, but before you look at it, it's not set.
Mm-hmm.
And especially like with async programming and just timing things, that's definitely true. If you step through something, it's not going to run the same way as it would if you just let it run and then log the results somewhere.
Mm-hmm. NPoco also supports dynamic natively. So if you are executing a very complicated query and the return types from it aren't easily mappable to the POCOs you have defined, you can just tell it, I'd like you to return for me a dynamic, and then you can just pull the data right off the dynamic. You can
Mm-hmm.
even go as simple as having it return an object array. where you just fill up an object array and I'm going to pull the objects out of there and do whatever I want to. So it's just wrapping basically the DB data reader in a very quick, easy way, and then you can just pull the object apart yourself. So you don't have to use all of the mapping features if you end up with these very complicated situations, which, as much as we'd like to avoid, will inevitably happen in any sort of database instance.
Sure. Especially when we have databases that were written without NPoco in mind and over, various decades of different coders and everything. Yeah. So there's another feature I was thinking about from EF and EF Core, and I'm assuming you're going to tell me that NPoco doesn't have it, and that's fine, but I just wanted to mention it since we're kind of talking about ORMs more in general too, is the idea of code first. And in EF Core, what happens is you design your POCOs and you either put those attributes on them or you write out your fluent mapping, and then you use command line, something like migrate database or add database migration. I can't remember the exact commands. And what it does is it builds for you a fluent SQL builder that will actually upgrade your database like a script to whatever the new design is. So if I add a field to a table, I mean, it'll design your entire database at first if you just give it a bunch of POCOs. And of course, your DB context that I mentioned has to be set up right. But then if I add a field to a particular POCO and I run that migration script, it will automatically add that to the database as well, which is really cool, but it's also terribly error prone in the sense that it's very hard to undo your own mistakes, especially if you don't understand SQL because you're doing it all that way. And so I know that's the way I was running before coming to our current company, where I had to learn a lot more SQL and get a lot more comfortable with doing that more by hand. So I assume that NPoco doesn't try to do anything like that with actually setting up the database.
Nothing quite so advanced. And that is a really useful feature, and I had forgotten about that sort of thing. And then there's another ORM that's really big on Reddit called Chain, and they support the other side of that where you can connect it to a database and it will read the schema of everything. And it will generate the POCOs for you. It'll spit out a file that you can then drop into your project, and it will just know how to do all of that. Those features are really nice, but NPoco kind of shies away from that side of thing because that's, like you said, a bit more error prone, and I feel like that's more of the let's quickly throw a database together. A lot of the use cases for NoSQL databases are we don't even know what it's going to look like right now. Let's just boot it up, get it running, and then we can figure it out as we go along. And I think those features are good for that. Whereas NPoco is a bit more you already know how to build your database. Perhaps it already exists, or you've got somebody who knows SQL very well, and it's designed to work in that way instead.
Yeah, I don't think those tools are very useful, especially if you're getting started and you're less familiar. And I think EF Core might be able to go the other direction too. But most of the tutorials and everything are really designed for that C# developer who doesn't understand SQL. And I know that's just kind of the crux of the whole argument for and against ORMs or different levels of ORM management is how much are we helping the developer be more productive versus how much are we hiding issues that the developer should probably be aware of. And where do you fall on that?
Well, I'm glad you brought it up because that's where I was going next. I don't think that there is a truly strong argument against ORMs. You can make arguments against specific ORMs, but even if you're, we have to handwrite all the SQL, our database is super special, nothing is ever going to fit, it's really hard to even argue against at least Dapper, at least something that's just a few extensions off of ADO.NET. I know SQL. And I think that if you're looking for any sort of generalized performance or anything special about your database, you should just learn SQL. I don't think an ORM hiding it from you is necessarily bad if you are aware that it is hiding from you and you have the tools
Right.
to say, what are you really doing under the hood? I think if you're just kind of getting started and you just need a database and you really don't want to spend that time, yeah, okay, just throw something together, get it working as a proof of concept. But if you're going to be working with databases, it's really important to learn that because someday you're going to run into a problem. And the
Mm-hmm.
only information you're going to get is the SQL statement that's being executed. And if you can't read that, if you can't understand that, you're never going to be able to understand what went wrong.
Right.
And it's sort of like I'm sure there's a lot of different utilities that will generate entire web pages for you, and you never have to know a single thing about HTML or CSS. But then, as soon as you find that one instance that that tool cannot help you with, you've then worked your way into a very unpleasant corner. And that's my way of thinking about ORMs as well.
WordPress.
Yeah. Yeah, don't get me started
Yeah.
on WordPress.
Well, been there, did that.
But I think it's the same thing. I mean, SQL is not a particularly easy dialect to learn. I mean, I don't ever want to like trivialize it and make it seem like if you don't learn it, you're an idiot or anything at all. But it is a
Right.
very useful tool, and there's a lot of fantastic resources out there into learning how to use it. And I really can't imagine being in a place where you're using a database and don't know at least the basics of it.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. I think that I found myself caught in that trap where, like I said, my migrations would go astray before I knew SQL very well, and I really didn't know how to get myself out of a quandary or a corner that I had put myself in using EF Core. And so learning the SQL language and learning to write both the direct query scripts but also the upgrade scripts and the downgrade scripts, how do I undo something that I upgraded incorrectly, or what's the safe way to do that? How, if this exists, then drop it, but if it doesn't exist, don't drop it because that'll throw an error.
Mm-hmm.
um, that kind of stuff. And I really appreciate knowing that. But I also wonder, from the flip side, a really high level ORM like Entity Framework also gives you the opportunity to potentially completely move away from SQL altogether into something like a full document database or a NoSQL database, something. So it's in that way, maybe it's more future proof and lets
Mm-hmm.
you, like I said, you just, oh, well, I just need that MongoDB package that makes that an endpoint for EF Core. I don't really know for sure that it supports MongoDB, but just as an
Mm-hmm.
example, I wouldn't be surprised if it does support some NoSQL databases.
Oh, NoSQL is an entire other topic to get into
Sure.
at another time. But yeah, there is some arguments there, and a lot of it I think does come down to performance. If you're really not super concerned about your queries, the difference between say zero point 0.1 seconds and zero point 0.5 seconds means nothing to you, then don't worry about it. Go to Entity Framework. There's hundreds of tutorials. It's incredibly well supported. You will find somebody who will be able to help you with any problem you're having. And that might even be Microsoft itself. I know they're very active at taking user feedback there. And if you are really concerned about squeezing out every drop of performance, where you want to have complete control, that is where you're moving far more into the micro ORM side of things. And that is, I wanted to talk about a few of the downsides of NPoco because it's not a perfect
Yeah.
piece of software. The documentation is not great. There is a few examples out there, but there's a lot of features that you can read and look at and be like, oh, okay, I think I understand what this means. Like a query that's single by ID or default means that you want to get the single record that matches this ID, and if it doesn't exist, return the default of that POCO, which is traditionally null. There's no documentation about that anywhere on NPoco's website. You just have to look at it and be like, I think I understand what this is doing. And so
Right.
there is a learning curve there where you can occasionally just get kind of confused and you're going to have to dig through the code a little bit. While the author is active for NPoco and it regularly gets updates whenever bugs are found, it can sometimes be months and months between issues. I have reached out to him before and got a response within a week, and there was another time I reached out to him and it was almost a year before I heard back from him. This is just a side project. It's not a fully featured product
Right.
that's designed for, Entity Framework is being used at Microsoft. And so there is those downsides there. Some of the names they use for things, like their connection is called an iDatabase, and their SQL builder is called SQL, which is
Right.
just confusing to me. And
Yeah.
so there are some downsides to it, but I have very infrequently run into something that I couldn't figure out just by looking through their wiki, looking through old issue lists, doing a couple of Google searches, or even just looking at the source code.
Yeah, I was going to ask you. I mean, you said you reached out to Showtime a couple times. Do you know, is he open to like pull requests and other people contributing to that?
Well, right now there are 20 open pull requests on here, but some of these are from 2013, and my assumption is that they're probably not good pull requests or such. The most recent one is November 5th of 2019, which suggests to me that it's probably that he didn't want to merge those in. Not positive on it or whatever, but since it is open source, you can always just download it and fix it yourself and then just use the fixed version of it.
Sure.
But he does respond on there, and it's a lot of these, and actually I'm just kind of glancing through them. A lot of these are here's an error, and they don't give any information about it. And I can
Yeah.
imagine that's why he doesn't want to do a pull request, is they're not really explaining why they thought that code was there. And not that I'm going to make assumptions over what he thinks, but since it is open source, go for it, grab it, fix it
Yep.
yourself. I have a whole
Fork it.
large series of extensions to it that I've developed over the years of using it that just make it a bit more useful in my cases.
Well, wait, maybe we need to get the forked GitHub repository of TPoco up and
Yeah, there we
running,
go.
or TJPoco.
There you go. It's everybody wants to write their own ORM. It's actually kind of a joke. If you go online and you're like writing an ORM, there's dozens and dozens of articles. And, I would say about every 2 or 3 months on Reddit, somebody's like, I wrote a new ORM. And then it's, why would we use this instead of the hundreds of other ones out there? But I think on some
Right.
level, there is something fun about trying to understand. And I've looked through the entire source of NPoco because I was just curious, how does it work? What is it really doing underneath the hood? And I found it quite fascinating. And it is just one of those things I would love to write my own someday, just for the sake of learning how to do it better.
All right. Well, let's wrap this up. And thank you for sharing all of that about NPoco.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have anything else you wanted to tell us about NPoco?
Not right now, but I'm sure after we're done with the
Okay.
podcast, I'll think of something, as I usually do.
Of course. We could add more notes to the blog post page as well. Let's talk about hotspots. So, my hotspot, I'm going to go first this week, give you a chance to think. And this is an old tip, but I'm not an old developer. Well, I am an old developer, but I haven't been a developer that long. So, it's kind of new, and it came up in my memory as we were talking about migrations and code first and mapping and all of that stuff. Did you know that in Visual Studio, at least, I haven't tried this in Writer, but in Visual Studio, if you drag and drop or copy and paste a JSON file into Visual Studio, you can paste as a C# class,
I did
as a
know
Poco.
that. I did
You
actually
did
know
know
that.
that.
Yes. And it is an amazing feature. Absolutely
Right.
amazing.
And XML as well. It also
Mm-hmm.
supports XML. I just think that's so cool. That blew my mind when I heard that, because I know I've spent hours, and I probably still do when I forget that tool's available. Just, okay, here's my JSON. All right, let me type in the C# or vice versa. So yeah, that's my hotspot. It's just that little tool in Visual Studio that you can import JSON or XML directly, and it will create a C# class for you.
I used a website that would do that, where you could just paste in, XML or JSON, and it would spit it out. And that one always had a few issues, but once I discovered that Visual Studio could do it, I was like, oh wow, this is super cool, and it's very, very nice to work with it.
Yeah. When I was a very beginner programmer and I was switching from Swift to Java, I really wished there was a program that would just let me dump in my logic and spit it out. And I even tried to write one in Swift that would spit out Java. You get like just a left and right panel here, type in your Swift and it spits out Java. But of course, it's more work than it's worth, and you end up with bugs in it. And that it's not so much the language that's the problem, it's the hardware framework that is different between like iOS and Android or, anything like that. So, yeah, that was a silly idea.
I don't know. There's something fun about trying to figure out that sort of stuff.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it definitely helped me learn the two languages and the differences between them. So, nothing's totally wasted.
Well, that gives me a pretty good idea on my hotspot, and I kind of mentioned it. And that is, I think that GitHub is an amazing resource when you have these open source projects, because being able to look through somebody else's code, look through their comments, look through commits, understand other people's code is a very, very useful thing. And there's so many wonderful packages. Entity Framework Core is another great example that is completely open source. And I don't think enough people spend time digging through other professional products and looking to see, this is the state of code that Microsoft is willing to show to the world. What does that mean? Oh, okay, I never thought about doing unit tests. All of these GitHub packages all have unit tests. Well, let's see how they chose to do it. Why did they do these particular types of unit tests? Oh, this thing's got a readme.md. I never thought about doing that. What is that? And oh, that's a markdown. Oh, this is how GitHub uses this. It's a very wonderful learning resource to be able to look through all that sort of thing. And people regularly like that sort of thing. I mean, there's so many of these open source packages want contributors, and you don't have to be some god tier, been programming since you were 2 years old person to contribute to a lot of these open source projects. And being able to kind of look through that and contribute to those can give you a lot of contacts in the industry and just a better understanding of code. I've seen so many poorly formatted code posts on like Reddit or Stack Overflow, and just by looking at how other people do things can give you a stronger ability to present your own code in those situations as well. And so I love going through GitHub and just, oh, I need a logger. Well, here's the logger I'm going to use. Well, this one's open source. I'm going to read everything about it. Because if you understand how something works, it just gives you that ability to predict those sorts of weird bugs or fix them if they ever do arise.
Right. Yeah, I have to say, I mean, I know you described that, I think, in our very first episode when we were talking about how we got started, about how much you read code on GitHub, and that still amazes me. Not that I don't do it at all, I certainly do, but I would much rather find a wiki or a blog post or a Stack Overflow answer simply because of the volume of content that you have to scroll through to find a particular answer if you're looking at an actual code base. But I don't disagree with what you're getting out of it at all. I mean, I totally understand. You're getting a bigger picture. You're getting, you're finding the little gotchas that the developers had to go through, and just getting a better sense of how things are put together. So yeah, I should definitely do more of that.
GitHub makes it easy just to clone. I mean, you can just download a zip file of the entire system if you don't want to go through Git. And being able to load that up in your IDE and navigate to definitions and fluently move through the code is very, very nice. In Rider, I know that you can zoom to source and it will decompile like third-party DLLs, but then you're missing all the comments, and sometimes that decompilation hides certain bits of cleverness that is in the code base. And so I have an entire folder on my hard drive just full of like 30 or 40 projects that I've cloned locally just to dig through them and look through the raw source, because then you get all of your wonderful syntax highlighting and, go-to references and all of those wonderful features.
I think that was the piece I was missing, Tim, because I was trying to do all the browsing that I've done, I was trying to do it on the web portal for GitHub. And so I didn't have any of my IDE support there. I mean, I certainly have cloned packages, but those were more, I really want to use this rather than just I want to read this,
Yeah, and so it's something I would definitely recommend is just, pull it locally, dig through it. One of the things I really like looking through in particular are utility libraries. Somebody will be like, here's all of these really tiny little extensions and really little simple things that I've found use for over the years. And looking at those can often get me to think like, okay, why did this person create this extension method? They thought this was something that they were going to use constantly. Is this something that maybe I didn't realize I could have been doing more efficiently with an extension method? Well, then I discover that. So yeah, it's just, I really like going through that sort of thing. It's something I would recommend as just a look at other people's code, because it can help you be better at your own.
All right. Well, if you have made it this far in this episode, we hope that you will leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Google Play or Stitcher or wherever you get your podcasts, or leave us a comment at tocode.software, and you can find the episode 10 and all the other episode links right there, and show notes, blog posts, lots of other stuff. And honestly, we need your help getting the word out, because we're just getting started here, but we've got 10 episodes now, and we think that, other people might want to hear this too, but it's hard to get found in those podcast stores. So if you are listening and you enjoyed the program, not only leave us a review, but tell a friend, share it on Slack with your co-workers, spread the word, and let us know what you think. Let us know what we can do better. We'd love to hear back from you.
Absolutely. And I also would like to specifically ask anybody who's gotten this far, would you be interested in a live stream of the two of us? I used to stream on Twitch all the time, and I kind of brought up the idea of the two of us just chatting on Twitch perhaps, and letting people come in and, add comments or a bit more interactive. If you think that would be something interesting and you'd like to participate, let us know.
Yeah, definitely. We're open to new ideas. Live stream is a big one. I did the one blog post about MVVM after we did that episode, so I'm happy to do more of those as well. Whatever would help you in your developer journey. All right, Tim, we made it.
Yes, we did. 10 in the basket. Here's to 10 more.
Yep, 10 times 10. We're going to make it to 100.
Oh, yeah.
Have a great week.
You too.